Okay, guys. So my name is Taimoor Changaiz, and I have 8 years of professional working experience in Ruby on Rails development. And currently, I am working at Sendoso, Pakistan. So today, our topic is like how to draw our specs using RSpec. So I will tell you about how we can avoid code duplication while writing our test cases, and also besides talking, like giving you only the presentation, we will practice those things too. So let's make this session productive and let's start. First of all, let's repeat our concept of dry principle. So while writing our code in our applications, we have to follow deadlines and deliver things on time. So in that case, some people tend towards accomplishing tasks and lose their focus on writing things in a better way. But whenever you come across such a situation in your life, just remember that haste makes waste. So in the long run, work done in the haste causes huge pain in the future. So the dry principle enforces you to do something once and only once. And if we follow this principle, then as a result, we have to write in less code and we will introduce fewer bugs in our code base. As you know that more code means more bugs. So code written using this principle is easy to maintain and test, and in the long run, it can save a lot of time. So it's time to take an oath today, which is I will not repeat myself. Like we have to repeat and say it even 1,000 times to ourselves that from now on, I will need not repeat myself. So I will not repeat myself is a mantra which we should follow all the time, even in our real life. And we should make a promise with ourselves that whenever we write a piece of code, we will follow this golden rule. So the question is how to avoid repeating code while writing test cases. Today, I will share with you some practices which I use to write lesser code in test cases. First one is transient attribute. The transient attribute is actually a thing which is provided by the factory board. So actually the word transient means temporary, but in spec this means that we will create some temporary attributes which do not exist in the database, and we will use these attributes to set different values of actual attributes of factory objects depending on different scenarios. In our test cases, to check different scenarios against a class, like we have to create some factory objects and there might be a little bit of different in their values. Like as you can see that in our case, we are using transient attribute uppercase to make the name of this user uppercase if we want for this certain object. Otherwise, it will remain as the normal name of the user. So factory, in this way, we can like introduce temporary attributes and reduce our code duplications. Because as you know that many factory objects are written and like same attributes are repeated, one or two attributes are changed. So it means that we repeat code again and again. For such cases where repetition is unnecessary, we will use transit attributes. Within factory board, like this is the factory board and we are creating factory. So we can pass a different value to transient attribute rather than their default values. These are the default values of transient attributes. Like this rockstar and upcase attribute does not exist in our database table, but we created these temporary attributes by defining them in transient do and block. So if we want to change the value of this any of this attribute, we can pass the updated value, like on which we will perform some actions while creating the object, as we are doing over here. Like by default, upcase is false, but while creating the object of this user, we pass the upcase true. And to make this thing effect in our object, what we have to do is in our callbacks, like this is the after create callback of spec, what we will do, the first parameter is the factory object which we are creating. The second one, evaluator, is related to transient attribute. What evaluator is? Evaluator is like something, an object, or it is can be considered as a struct, which is like something like object, and we can access it attributes like with the dot. So whatever number of transient attributes we pass to this factory object, those can be accessed with the evaluator, which we will pass as second argument in the callback. And to access that, we will use evaluator and dot, and after we will mention the transient attribute. This is how we will access the transient attribute, and we will make like some specific change on the data on the basis of this attribute. So another concept in writing spec is inheritance. Like inheritance is a concept which every programmer is familiar with, and that can also help us to reduce code repetition in specs. Like over here, we can like use inheritance in factory board in two ways. Like one way is to use the factories, uh, where we will introduce a nested factories in it, and actually these two belongs to the same object. These two are the factories of the same object, but some of attributes are different for this one. Like the convention is to only mention the required attribute which are necessary to create a certain object. Like for the post, we may be necessary to have like the title attribute in it, but for the approved post, we will have we will need to have a true object in it, like a true value. But for all the posts, we don't need to have a approved value in it. So what we will do is we will add the default attributes in the base factory, and then we will nest multiple factories, and we will add the attributes which are required in them. And there is another way to do it, like to create separate factories for the same object class, but mention the parent with the parent keyword. Like we can add a metadata to say that what is the parent of this factory object. So these two are the different approaches which we can use while creating our factories. So this is another great way to reduce the code while creating the factories. So another thing, as we all know, that sharing is caring, but our spec actually implemented this expression by introducing the shared context and shared example. Like we have two different concepts in specs. Like one is shared context and other is shared example, and they believe in the same concept, like sharing is caring. Why is that? Because they reduce the code duplication in our specs. So let's first talk about shared context. So shared context is like in test cases, we need to write down methods, subjects, hooks, and let statements to define some variable or some seed data for the test cases, whatever it is. In some test cases, we write the same and repeated statement again and again. Like if we need a product factory object, and we created it using let, and we are repeating that let in every factory and every spec file which have to use that object. So for that case, that is unnecessary duplication. We can avoid that. So we will see and we will practice that how like how to do that, how we can achieve the less duplication in our code while writing specs. So this is the syntax of how to define a shared context. So shared context is defined like by adding the keyword shared underscore context, and here we will mention the name of the shared context. And after that, we can mention a metadata, like the name of this context can be products shared context or user shared context, whatever we want, like for whatever object we want the attributes to be created, we will name that. And also the metadata is also important. Like these two are the things which can be used to access this or include this shared context in a spec. Like in our specs, we can either include context and then mention the name, or while defining our RSpec describe block, we can add that metadata at the end of that. So it will also include the shared context in it. So as you can see that, like in shared context, we can add before hooks, after hooks, let, subject, and methods in it. So we can define whatever things are duplicated and repeated in the project while writing our spec, and we can make that as a shared context. So this is the way to like how we can create a shared context. Okay, let's move to the other thing, like what is shared example? And this is another great feature which RSpec offers us. So in some cases, there are almost the same examples. Examples are like it blocks in the specs that are used in the same spec file or even in some different spec file. Like there may be some specs which are like of shared nature. Like if we want to check that whether a, an object can store a different type of like Chinese data or emojis in it. So we can share that spec for every model, and we can include that and reduce the code duplication in that case. And there are many more examples which we come across in real life, and we use it more in our code base to like reduce the like code base size. So main thing for the shared example is we use these to avoid code duplication. So whenever these things are declared, these are not auto loaded or not like executed when we execute the RSpec command to execute the specs. We need to execute them by including them in the spec. This is the case for the shared example and for the shared context. These don't execute on their own. So the question over here is like for the specs which want to use some shared examples or shared context, what they have to do, they need to require them and they need to specifically or explicitly or implicitly include them. One more thing is like we can also pass params to the shared examples to modify it in our needs. Like depending on some different scenarios, we can pass the params. So let's see how to define a shared example. So shared example is defined as like writing the RSpec dot shared underscore example, and then following the name of that example. It can be like whatever we want the name of this example can, like it can be like treated as a context block or describe block for the shared examples. And also we can pass the parameter to it. So parameter is optional. We can skip this, and we can also pass as many parameters as we want. So here what it is doing is it is getting the parameter and assigning it to some variable. using the let. And then everything remains the same. Like we write how we were writing the specs and examples in our RSpec, all those things remain the same. Like this it blocks remain the same. And we can treat this, and to make our understanding, to make it easy for us, we can think of it as a context or describe block. And it can contain multiple it blocks in it. So now let's talk about conventions. Like we know that RSpec has amazing features. We can share context or share examples, but where should I place these things? Like what is the best way to do that? So people follow two approaches. Like the first one is they directly add the files in the spec folder and name them like shared example 4, and then the model name whatever they want. But what I prefer is I prefer like these are something which are like giving a sport, like as a, these are treated as sport attributes. So we should make another folder in the spec named as sport, and then create a subfolder in that, like where we can add shared examples. So we will add all the shared examples in this shared example folder. So I prefer that we should go with this approach. So it like keep all the shared example stuff in one place instead of scattered around. So that is like easy to read and understand like where our shared example are placed. But it is up to you, like how you want it and where you want to be placed. So as I told you earlier that these things don't actually like can, can be called or required on their own. So we have to do that. So one thing is to require these things explicitly on the file which need them. Like the first one is a way to like, if I write the require statement above my spec file, like in the model spec, I write the require and then add this line. So it will require the specific example in that. So, but there is another approach to do that. Like we can add this line in our spec helper file and spec helper.rb file, and it will add all the sport related file at once. And we don't need to explicitly require these things. And one more thing to keep in mind is like for the specs which need to use these things like shared example or shared context, these things should be included before the specs themselves. So otherwise it will cause like error on those specs. So if you want to include this way, so you should keep it at the top of the file instead of anywhere else. So let's practice, and then we will see how we can achieve with these things. So I have created a folder or project for you to practice RSpec. So our time is short and we want to cover it in 30 minutes. So for that, we need to do that. So let's zoom in. So first of all, what you need to do is you need to create a project and add these gems. So first one is RSpec Rails gem, which provides the space, like which provide the power to write the RSpec test cases in Rails. And then we will add a factory board, which will use to create factories. While we need seed data, or we need some data to be uh, on which we can perform some actions and we can test the things. We need the objects so that we can test data, and then we can test scenarios on them. So for that, we need the factory board gem. And also another gem, like in some cases, we need to create some fake data. We don't want to like fix the data while creating our factories. So what we will do is we use the faker gem. But the caution over here is like we should not use faker gem while like on those fields which have some impact on our logic, like it can derive to some other path. So in that case, if we use faker for storing or adding those values, so in that case, what will happen? In some cases, your spec will pass, and in some cases, those spec will be failed. So, like if you want to check like whether a user is admin or not, and you add the role through faker gem, then sometime it will add the role as admin, or sometime it will add the role as normal user. So the spec will fail in some cases. So after adding this gem, you need to run the command bundle install, and then run this command raise generate RSpec install. What this command will do, it will create .rspec file and spec folder, also these two files which are necessary to write RSpec test case. So let's move forward to factories. Let me zoom in. So as I already told you that factories are created so that we can access objects, like they feel like that we are accessing from the database, and these things are behaving in the same way in the real application. So, and in factories, like we can use the syntax factory dot define to define some factory, and then we need to mention the factory name which we want to use. Like this is the object name, or you can say that model name, which we can use like to create the data for this model. And these are the database fields for this model, which we are using over here. And also I have created the comments factory, which have description field and publish field, author ID and post ID in it. So same is the post factory, but it doesn't have the post ID because the comments are related to post, but post is not related to comments. Okay, so what I told you earlier that like we need to add that configuration over here, like which we talked about over here. So what we can do is just like I prefer doing this way. I copy this path and then add it over here in our spec helper file. So this is like the thing I will tell you later, but like just add this thing over here. Okay, so let's move to author specs. So like I'm going to show you how to write some model spec, and then we will show you how to reduce the code like using shared context and shared examples. So first let's practice about what is shared context. Like in some cases I want to like write some specs, and I want to mention like before hook, and here I want to specify a first name as the subject. So let me zoom in so that you can guys can see properly. Okay, so and then I define a let, like I name it as fake author, because as you can see, like I can add the factory and then add the faker gem, the first name and last name using the faker gem. So here is the use of the faker gem. Like what we can do is this will generate fake name for this author, and we don't need to like worry about. And same thing will happen for the last name. What we will do is faker name dot last. And if we want to generate an email, a fake email for this, we don't want to write emails again and again. So what we can do is use the faker gem over here too. Okay. So in author specs, I am creating the fake author. Like I named it fake author because I will not pass any attribute to this factory object. it will create those things on its own. And then we use subject. These are things which we normally use while writing our specs. And these things will go into shared context, because in some cases these things will be duplicated over and over again in multiple specs. So we can avoid duplication by writing these things in the shared context. But not all the times we need to add these things in the shared context. Sometimes when we really need these. And then like I add a method, a full name, like somehow I add is first name, and then I want to add the last name in it. Like we can do that by subject dot last name or whatever, or so what it will do is it will get the first name from the before hook, and it will get the last name from the subject. So in this way we can also get these things from the fake author. So like if these things are needed, and like for instance we need to access that fake author object, as you can see that in factories I need author ID. So if I require this thing for this comment or post specs, what we need to do is like we need to repeat this thing over and over again for all the specs. So and many more things can be repeated, like we can also need a full name or whatever things. So these things can be reduced by using the shared context. So let's move back to author spec. And what we will do is we will move these things in shared context, and then we will use how to import those things and use them, like these are already defined over here. Okay. So let's first like write some spec over here to see that whether it's working or not, like the things which we have written, the things are working or not. And then we will move these things to shared spec or shared context. So I think you guys are already familiar with these things, but let me explain you again. Like this is the it block, like this is where we write the specs. So this is the expect statement where we pass our things object or like variable which we want to test that whether it is working fine or not. So here I have assigned it the name Taimoor. So I want to check that whether it is working or not. So let's move to this control console and write this command. Like our spec was written in spec model. So what we can do is spec model and author spec. So what it will do, it will try to run all spec in author spec.rb file. So what it is saying that we need to run migration so that our DB is installed for test cases. So as you can see that it's working fine. So this is the syntax that it shows us like this is working fine. So what we can do is Like as you can see that in subject, I added a name, first name as Bilawal, but the last name is created through faker, which can be any name. So what I can do is like check whether it checks subject, subject's first name, first name is Bilawal. So we will do the same things, but right now what we will do is we will access the first name using the subject, and we will check that whether it is equal to, like first make it an empty string and then see what will happen over here. Like this should fail, the second one should fail. So it said that expected is blank, like we said that our expectation is this name should be blank, but actually we got Bilawal. Like we write the name over here, this is the actual thing, but we're expecting that it should be equal to some empty string. So if we write the correct thing, it will work fine. Okay, so as you can see that things are working, so let's move these things to shared context. Like there may be some case where these things are required in multiple files, and so we need to move this thing into shared context. So let's move it there. So first of all, what I need to do is I need to create a folder, subfolder under spec directory named as port, and then I will add another folder named as shared context, and here I will add some file like to store the shared context of the author. So what we can say that, like, so it is shared author's context, author context. We can name whatever we want, but right now this makes sense. So let's make like first let's add the shared context for this author. So shared context, this is how we define it, and name here, and then we can add a metadata, meta, like whatever, meta over here, and then we copy these things over here. So that's it. This is how we can create a shared context. Like, let me repeat myself. To define a shared context, you just need to use the reserved word shared context and then name over here. Like I will say that it is author's shared context, whatever name you want. And here I can name it as author context, whatever you want. You can write over here. So, so let's use this context in our author's example. So first remove this code. So now these things are not defined, and if we run the spec, these things will fail because these things are not defined. They are saying that expected is equal to Taimoor, but we got nil. So expected is Bilawal, but we got nil because there is nothing in subject over here. So let's move back to spec helper file. As I told you that I prefer this way to include the files in, to include all the support files in my specs. Other approach is like to require those file in specs explicitly. So what it do is it will check that all the RB files in the spec support folder in subdirectory, so include all of them. So what it will do, it will include the shared context, author context file before loading the spec. But it has drawback. If you want to like execute a single spec file at once, and so in that case on local system, like it may cause like issues if there are many shared context or shared example file. But in production it will work fine. Like you have to write all, you have to execute all the specs, and then loading all the shared context or example file is not a problem over there. So let's move back to our example. So how we can include this shared context in our author spec? Like as you know that we cannot access these things. So how we can check that and how we can include these things in our spec? So the first approach is, which I prefer, is like you can use include context and then copy the name of this context. That's it. So what it will do, it will like load all the stored thing whenever this statement is called in that specific file. So these statement will not execute if you haven't like loaded this file by like I showed you in the spec helper file, or and this statement is also required. Like you need to include this context in some specific file so that you can access the variables written over here. So all the things will be accessible over here. So let's see by running our specs whether it works fine or not. Yes, it is working fine. So that's how we write shared context. Okay, so let's move to another thing. Before moving to over there, I have to show you another way. Like this is the implicit way to include the shared context in your specs file. Like add the metadata which was written over here in the shared context. Just include it in your spec file. So in that case, you don't need to include this way. So this is the implicit way to include this thing. But I prefer the below one. Like you can execute this one and see whether it works or not. It will work same. But my preference is below. Like I prefer to do it this way. Like it is clear that you have included something. Okay, so let's move to other thing and quickly like do that too. So first thing we need to do is like we need to like some write some spec, and then we will make those specs like as shared examples, and then include in our comment and post specs. So what we need to do, first we need, like in this case, to define some statements to see that whether like the thing which I have already written, like the fake author, we can use that, and then we can use this thing like factory bot to create the object of this class, comment, and then author ID, because it is required over here. So what we will do is fake author ID. So that's it we want from here. And let's try some examples. Like it checks whether author exists or not. So this is how I will tell you that how shared examples can be used and how code duplication can be removed. So now have moved to shared examples. So expect fake author dot id not to be nil. So here what we are saying that whether it is persistent or not, or the other way to check it's persistent, we can use that fake author dot persisted dot to be true. So this should work. Like right now we are in comment spec. So right now I have to run this file only. So it's showing error like, yeah. So I mistakenly add an underscore between them. So there is no underscore between 2 and B. So as you can see that it is working fine. So here two concepts are also clear that we can add multiple expect statement in one 8 block. So it is also good practice. Some people think that it is not a good practice to like write multiple expect statement and then check that comment author is assigned. So we created the subject, and for this comment object we have assigned an author to it. So we have to check that whether object.author id like we can check that whether it is same author which object we have created, or we can also check that not to be nil. Okay, so there's spelling mistake in it. And one more thing I need to make sure over here is like in some cases I'm using B, and in some cases like I'm using equal. Like equality checks the whether the objects are same. Like if there are two strings and I use the B thing, then the spec will fail. Like I will show you. So you can see that these two strings looks like same, but their object reference is different. So here what we can do is we will use the equal EQ. So all of our specs are passing, like we're checking that whether, okay, an author is assigned to comment or not, and then check whether an author exists. But as you can see that in post spec, what, so there is no need to this spec anymore. So in post spec, what I can do is I will just copy and paste and then just replace comment with post, and then over here post. Everything remains fine, but these are different spec and it is different spec file. But we need to check these things for this post spec too. So this is code duplication. Like if we can see that uh, spec will work fine, it is okay. Everyone is happy that we have committed more number of lines than someone else, but that's not way to do a thing. What we need to make sure is we need to write less code. So to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce another folder in support folder. Like there is shared examples folder. You can name it whatever you want, but this is how I prefer. So like you can name it like shareable content examples. Like post and comments both are shareable things. So whatever name you want, you can choose. But here it makes sense that post and comments are shareable. So shareable content is more suitable to us. So how to write a share example in RSpec? It is like this way: RSpec dot shared, and then examples, and then name, and then metadata like which we use in shared context. Same thing we can follow over here, and then that's it. This is how we can write a basic shared example. Okay, let me zoom in. So let me write it again because it was not zoomed in. So RSpec shared examples. This is how we write shared example. So RSpec dot shared examples, and then the name over here of the example, and then metadata. So we can either include it in our specs, either using the name or metadata. So this is how we can write the basic example. Or if we want to add some attribute, param attribute to this thing, so we can add param 1, 2, whatever we want. So like over here, I can say that class name, whatever we want to use. Okay. So right now we don't need metadata. So we will add some name, a meaningful name like shareable content. So it is about author spec. So we can also say that shareable contents, author examples, whatever, or we can skip the example part over here. Okay. So what we can do is we just get all the things from here, or beside this, we just copy this thing. We can also copy these two things, but I think that that can be used like adding shared context. It is your choice to do like which way you want to follow. Okay, let's move it to like some shared context. Sorry, shared example, and I name it shared context instead of shared content. Okay, it is shareable content, and we just copy and paste all the things from there. But here, one thing might confuse you that the post is like this will work for the post only, not the comments. So we will do that. We will see that how to do that. So first, let's comment all the stuff over here and just include example. Oh, it behaves like, yeah. So there are multiple ways to include shared example in a spec. Like we can use it behaves like, or it should behave like. These two are same. Or we can use include example. So, or metadata. But include example and metadata, they include a shared spec in current context. But what it behaves like, or it should behave like, do is these two add these spec in their nested content. So what's the meaning of this? Like, if you want to add some parameter to your shared example, and you write multiple examples and you use include example thing like this one, so the param you pass to the last one will win. Like, here you can pass like true, and in other example you want to pass false. But in both cases, when they will execute, only the false will be treated as the true parameter for both of these example. But this cannot be the case for this. So I prefer to use it behaves like. So right now, if we skip this thing, the parameter thing of this block, I have commented this parameter, and what we can do is like include this example and then check whether it works or not. Yeah, it is working as fine like it was working before. Now what we can do is we can add the class name as parameter. There are other approaches we can follow, but or we can pass a symbol like which will be used over here. So we can use class name or factory name, whatever we want. So it works the same. And if we include this same thing in the comments spec, it will also work same. Oh, I ran wrong spec. Okay, let's wait and then run comment spec again. So yeah, that's it. So this is the code which we save from duplication and then move to like one shared example. And we can save a lot of code in this way. So let's move to, yeah, our presentation. And if do you have any question, please comment those questions. And also I have exercise prepared for enthusiastic engineers. Like, we want you to write like you can learn the things by practicing. Like, you just watch the video and don't practice it, so you will not learn and polish yourself. So you have to practice. So the example is like you have to write controller specs with RSpec, and there are post and comments controller, and both are associated with author. So what we want from you is to use shared example, shared context, traits, transient, and nested factories. So all these concepts, and use them and create the specs for all CRUD operation for these controller. And yes, make sure that in some cases where we can share things, like we can make shared examples or shared context, please follow that too. So that's it for today. So if you guys have any questions, so I will check on Facebook and then I will try to answer you. Okay. So I think there are no questions. if you guys are confused about anything, or you guys like want me to explain something, so that would be great. So I tried to cover it in 30 minutes, but it took longer. So like writing and telling someone that how to do something, like it takes time. So in my mind, I thought that it would take only 30 minutes. So that's it, guys, for today. Okay. Thanks, Heather. Thanks, Fawad. So thank guys. Take care. Bye bye.